Sorry about walking in front of the camera. My normal videography could not make it today, and I needed to record this so you guys could get it in time. So I had to do it myself. Today what we're going to be speaking about is language or verbal messages. And the version of this chapter in the book is not particularly good. It doesn't really talk about language too much. It's more about verbal messages, which is okay. But I think you need to also include just the concept of language and what it is. And so I've made some pretty drastic changes, and you'll notice in the readings you didn't have to read this chapter because it doesn't really fit very well. So first we're going to talk about what language is, and then some characteristics of it, and so on. So first, what is language? Language is nothing more than a system of words, sounds, gestures that are common to a group of people that are used to communicate a message. And that's all language is. It's using symbols to communicate a message. And those symbols have to be able to be understood within the context of the entire community, or communication is not going to occur. This is why if you go to a foreign language, they don't speak the same language. They don't use the same words, and there can be confusion. And we're going to talk more about that later. But that's all language is. It's a system of words and symbols that we use to communicate messages. Now, language is used by a speech community, and a speech community is exactly what it sounds like. It's the group of people share the norms, they share the same code, they share the same symbols of how to communicate, what language, when to communicate, how to communicate, and so on. And the thing about speech communities is it's not about geographic location. You can have two groups of people that are not anywhere near each other, but essentially share the same speech community. They use the same language, they use the same symbols, they use the same codes. And that's what a speech community is. So we are all part of the English speaking speech community. And ultimately, when it breaks down to it, language is symbolic. And words are nothing more than symbols for something else, right? The word is not the thing. The word remote is not the remote. It's a symbol that we all agree means this thing. And so we're going to talk about some of that symbolism. We're going to talk about some of those symbols. And the first thing that you need to understand is that language and words are arbitrary, which means they're random. There's no reason why a remote is called a remote. And people are like, well, it's called this because in this language it's something similar and we just anglicized it. Well, sure, but if you follow that back, somewhere at some point in time, a couple of, I always picture it in my head, a couple of drunk cavemen sitting around a campfire going, rock, foot. That's what I picture in my head, because that's all the more planning went into it. Things are not the things, they're random. There's no reason why a remote is called a remote. There's no connection there at the core level. But we all have to agree what that code is. If we don't agree with that code, if I don't agree with this as a remote, and you don't agree with this as a remote, then it's probably not a remote. Language is also ambiguous. And ambiguous means that it means different things to different people. For example, if I say something is hot, what am I referring to? Well, I could be referring to physical attractiveness. Oh man, she's hot. I could be referring to temperature. I could be referring to spiciness of food. I could be referring to something that is popular right now. And even within that meaning, what does it mean? So let's look at temperature. If I say it's hot outside, what does that mean? In my mind, anything above like 70 degrees is hot. That's because I'm a fat guy. Fat guys get hot. So there's even layers of ambiguity, even if you can agree on the overall general meaning of something. So if I say to you, hey, get me a chair, what are you going to bring me? Something that I sit in, but other than that, they're all going to look very, very different. That's ambiguous. It means different things to different people. Language is also abstract. Words are abstract, meaning that the word isn't the thing, and meaning that it's only through words and language that we are able to communicate about abstract ideas. Try to describe or think about something like justice or love without using words or symbols of any kind. It would be very difficult. You would not be able to place things in any sort of hierarchy, which is what we'll talk about in a minute, because language allows us to do that, because it allows us to take abstract things and make them concrete in some way. And language is also, and words are also self-reflexive, meaning that the fact that we are able to talk about language is because language allows for that self-reflexiveness. We use it to communicate and improve our communication. Language is also changeable. It's not static. New words come and go all the time. Every year, around the end of summer, they add new words to the Oxford English Dictionary, and they take new words away. I mean, how often do you hear somebody use the word fortnight, meaning 2 weeks? I use it all the time. Or score, or bushwhack, or bamboozle. Those words used to be very common, and now nobody ever uses them. But not only that, but words change meaning. 150 years ago, the word gay did not mean what it means today. It meant something very different. So language is always changing. It's always in flux. And so you have to remember that. And the last symbolic nature of language element is that language is hierarchical. And what that means is we would not be able to create order in the world around us if we didn't have language. Because language allows us to put something above something else. A poor leader versus a good leader. A good piece of food versus a bad piece of food. The fact that we have those words to describe it allows us to put things in order. And as a side effect of that, there's a theory called the theory of muted groups. And what this theory states is that the group that is in charge actually can alter the meaning of words and control how words are viewed. For example, when a Democrat is president, the word taxes takes on a far more positive tone and usage because the Democratic National Party raises taxes. That's what they do. Not a good or a bad thing, that's just what they do to pay for social programs. So when a Democratic leader talks about taxes, they talk about it in a positive light. So people tend to view it more positively. However, when a Republican is in office, they tend to view taxes as more of a negative, as a burden. So they actually talk about taxation in a negative sort of connotation. So the people use taxes in a negative connotation and they view it negatively. So that's the theory of muted groups. Language is, the meaning of language, the meaning of words is within the people themselves. The words are only a small fraction of it. Yes, there's a word, we agree on it, what that word means, sort of. We have an overarching idea, but there's more to it than that. Because if I use a swear word, we'll say shit. To some people, that's no big deal, right? We all know what the word means. We know what the word means as a physical, as a noun, thing, something that come out of something's butt. That's, But we also have the greater meaning of the word as something is bad. And, if I say that, some people might be like, no big deal. They don't even register it, really. But other people might be offended by that word because you have a very different understanding and meaning of that word inside you. And so you are applying more meaning to words. This is where the concept of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt you. If you don't allow a word to hurt you, it can't hurt you. If you don't give it power over yourself, it's not going to hurt you. Like the word fat. I don't allow the word fat to have any power over me. People try to use it as an insult, and I'm like, whatever, yeah, so what? I may be fat, but you're ugly. I don't say that, but you know what I mean, right? So the meanings of the words are in you. And if you don't allow those words to have that impact on you, they're not going to. They lose power very easily. And we all apply our own meaning to words. What does love mean? It means something very different to different people, depending on their personal experiences, their frame of reference, which we talked about in the perception chapter. There are multiple levels of meaning that you need to be aware of when communicating. You have the denotative meaning of a word, which is the dictionary definition. This is what would be, in a dictionary if you looked it up. Like the example on the PowerPoint says dog. Domestic animal, a domestic carnivorous animal with a long muzzle and a fur coat with a long fur-covered tail whose characteristic call is a bark, right? We all can agree on that. However, in addition to this denotative, remember, that's how you remember it, denotative equals dictionary, D equals D. There is the connotative meaning of words. And the connotative meaning of words is the emotional impact that a word has on somebody. And this is very different in everybody. This is based on their frame of reference. This is based on their own personal experiences. So for some people, dog has a positive connotation, meaning we like it. We like dogs. I've had good experience with dogs. I love dogs, right? That's a positive connotation. It's man's best friend. They're a loyal companion. They're playful. They're loving. They're cute. They're fuzzy, right? That would be a positive connotation for dog. But like if I say pit bull, for many people the word pit bull has a negative connotation because the media has made it out like pit bulls are these vicious creatures that bite people's faces off all the time. So when you hear that word, many people have a negative reaction to the word pit bull because it's got that negative emotion attached to it. So when you are communicating, you have to keep that in mind. You have to understand that you can use the connotative meaning of words to help convey the overall message. For example, 9/11. Today, the day I'm filming this, is February 11th, 2015. So, 14 years ago, President Bush used very highly connotative language to create a certain sense of emotion in the people of America. And it worked. Whatever your feelings are for George W. Bush, the day of 9/11, when he was giving his speeches about what happened and what we were going to do, it united the country because he used language that had a high degree of connotation. It made the audience who was feeling extremely vulnerable, extremely emotional, it gave them certain things to hold on to. Patriotism, justice, terrorists. These were ideas that we were able to grab a hold of and really pour ourselves into that language. And so it worked very, very well. Again, whether you like him or not is irrelevant, but on that particular day, he brought us together through his connotative language. Messages can be both anonymous or anonymous. And everybody knows what anonymous is, right? It's you don't know who is saying it. We see this a lot online. We don't know who's sending the message. And so anonymous messages, anonymous messages, we don't know who sent them, which means that people tend to be a little bit more honest. They're a little bit more extreme because there's no accountability. You can't necessarily evaluate that person's credibility. Are they just making stuff up, or are they actually credible? But at the same time, it also allows people to express themselves in a way that they may not do if people knew who sent the message. So anonymous messages have both pros and cons. And the same goes for anonymous. You just drop the AN off of the word anonymous and you get anonymous. Anonymous messages are signed, meaning we know who sent them. We know who said them, right? There's an identifiable speaker. And therefore, that speaker has to deal with the consequences of whatever they say. In America, we like to talk about freedom of speech, which is a fantastic thing. However, that does not give you freedom from consequences of what you say. So sure, you can say whatever you want, but if you get punched in the face or stabbed in an alley because of what you said, that is because you're dealing with those consequences. So the moral of that story is just because you can say something doesn't necessarily mean you should say something. You have a chance to respond to an anonymous message. You can evaluate the sender's credibility. But a lot of times, because there's consequences, people tend to be a little bit more restricted in what they're saying, a little bit more closed. Now we're going to shift gears and take a look at language and culture. And when we talk about the intercultural communication section, there are a lot of different cultural aspects we're going to discuss. And language comes into play quite a bit. The first of these kind of cultural characteristics is a low context culture. A low context culture is a culture that communicates very directly, straightforward. The messages are very specific, they're very detailed. That would be like saying, "Why are you late today?" Right? It's very direct. Some cultures, like America, most of the Western cultures are low context cultures. They don't beat around the bush. But then you have cultures that are high context cultures that tend to communicate between the lines. They don't come right out and say things because of a variety of reasons, which we'll get into more in the culture chapter. But in language, or in high context cultures, they tend to beat around the bush more. It's more indirect because they don't want to offend anybody. They don't want to risk embarrassment. The messages can be a little bit more ambiguous. So instead of saying, "Why are you late today?" somebody from a high context culture might say, "Did you get stuck in traffic?" or "Did your alarm not go off?" They're basically they're saying, between the lines, they're saying, "Why are you late?" They're not coming right out and saying it in case there's a legitimate reason for you being late. That way they're not embarrassing you and they're not embarrassing themselves. High context cultures are cultures that tend to believe a lot in the concept of face, which we will get into more in the culture chapter. So that's one type of cultural element that impacts language choice. Another is power distance. And power distance within a culture refers to the distance between those in charge and those not in charge. And a high power distance culture, that gap is great, right? This would be like a dictatorship. Power is very unequal. Not just anybody can rise to a position of power. Communication in a high power distance culture is very formal. So think of the military. If you're a private, you don't just roll into your commanding officer, whether he's a captain or a major or colonel or general, whatever, and be like, "Hey, what's up, guy?" You don't do that. The language is very formal when you do get to communicate with them. Versus a low power distance culture, which is where the power is distributed evenly. Think of a democracy, right? In theory, anybody can rise to a position of power, and communication is a lot less formal. So even if President Obama rolled in here, I would be respectful to him, but I wouldn't necessarily be afraid to use more informal language because I'm not afraid of ending up as a head in a dumpster like I would if I was communicating in a high power distance culture like a dictatorship. Whereas, first of all, you don't communicate very often with those in power, and when you do, it's very formal, it's very ritualized because of that power gap. Now, when it comes to communicating, there are certain things, we're not particularly good at verbally communicating, as I've said over and over and over again. We tend to be mediocre communicators at best because we don't think about it very much. But there are things that we can do to make it better. And number one is engage in linguistic sensitivity. And linguistic sensitivity is language that is not exclusionary. It is not, it doesn't separate people. It doesn't create fake, false boundaries between people. You also want to use I language rather than you language. Own your feelings and thoughts. So instead of saying, you make me nervous on the job, say, when you watch me, I feel nervous. The first example, it's very accusatory. And so when you say that to somebody, they're going to get defensive and they're going to react to that. Whereas in the second one, you're saying, hey, when you watch me, I feel nervous. So you're not blaming them. You're just saying, okay, here's your action. which can be proven or disproven. And when that happens, this is how I feel. You're putting it on yourself. There's on the PowerPoint, there's a whole little chart of I language versus you language. Take a look at those. Again, linguistic sensitivity is using language that respects other people while avoiding language that can be offensive. So for example, as you can see on your PowerPoint, avoid the generic he or man when referring to things. Now, most of you could probably care less if somebody says mankind or a businessman. You probably don't care. But I know women that if you say mankind to them, they will slap you because they are like, you are completely invalidating the majority of people on the planet when you say mankind. And so rather than cause unintentional conflict, isn't it just easier to change a few words? Now, I'm not talking about the overblown sense of political correctness that the United States has fallen into. You are not going to make everybody happy no matter what you do. And saying mankind, I do not believe, is a mortal sin. But if you can simply say humankind and avoid a little bit of conflict, doesn't that make sense? Yes, it does. So you want to watch the language that you are using. You want to avoid what is known as non-parallel language. And non-parallel language, there's two types of non-parallel language. There's marking and unnecessary association. And in both of those, what you are doing is you are adding additional information into the sentence that doesn't need to be there. And you are doing it in a way that you may not even realize can be perceived in a negative light, but can be perceived in a negative light. So the first of these is marking. And marking is when you add a characteristic into the sentence that doesn't need to be there. So if I were to say, oh, Joe, a black student, is doing well. Now, I may have no maliciousness in my heart when I say that. I may literally just be using it as a descriptor of him as a human being. He's black or he's not black. But it can be perceived in a way that I am saying, I'm shocked that Joe, who is a black student, could be successful. Even if you don't mean it that way, your words can be perceived in ways that you are not aware of. And I get in trouble. I've been getting in trouble my entire life because I often speak before I think. So I have to force myself to eliminate those unnecessary characteristics. Now, a note on this. There are times when that characteristic is necessary. So if you have, say, a room full of 100 people, and somebody comes up and says, where's Joe? And I point to Joe and I say, he's that black guy over there. That is not the same thing as marking. That is actually an instance when the physical descriptor is actually needed. But in most everyday conversation, it's not needed. Like, I could still say that Joe is doing a good job without the black guy comment in there, right? And so don't use that stuff. Get rid of it. And then the second type of non-parallel language is what is known as unnecessary association. And this is where you add another person into the conversation that doesn't need to be there. So if I were to say, Sandy, who's married to a city councilwoman or a city councilman, is opening up a new business. It could be implied that Sandy is only opening up a new business because she's married to a city councilman. Even if I don't mean it that way, that is how it can be perceived. So it can be perceived as a slight, as an attack on Sandy's abilities to do her own thing. So like with marking, if that extra thing, gender, age, position, another person, if that is not needed for some very specific reason, it shouldn't be there. I shouldn't say, oh yeah, Felicity is a great female doctor, or Danny is a fantastic female driver. I shouldn't say those things because I don't need to. Watch prejudicial language. And prejudicial language is language that judges, right? It is language that is based on prejudice, which, if you remember back to the perception chapter, prejudice is totally normal. It's just simply judging things, making decisions about things based on a lack of information. But the minute you start using language that is based on that prejudice, that's when things start to turn into discrimination. So for example, let's say you have been told your entire life that Jewish people are greedy, they don't spend money. And you've heard the term, oh, he's going to Jew him down. I'm sure you've all heard that. Some of you maybe have even used that. Now, I don't even like to use the word Jew because in my mind the word Jew is like an attack. It almost feels accusatory, and I don't like it. So I like to refer to people as Jewish people whenever I have to use that word at all. I try not to. People are people. So prejudicial language would be something like, oh, he's Jewish. He just doesn't like to spend money. That would be prejudicial language. That, of course, makes common sense that you should not use language that is taking your internal thoughts and spitting it out loud, because that's where discrimination starts. That's where isms start. Respect what other people say about their feelings. Respect what other people are thinking. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but you shouldn't, when somebody says, oh, that movie makes me sad, you shouldn't say, well, why? It's not a sad movie. Well, to them it is. So don't, when people share their feelings with you, don't use language to destroy that idea. Another thing that we should be very cognizant of when using language is we should want to use the best, most clear language that we can possibly use. And I believe that technology is destroying this ability in Americans, specifically, probably everybody else as well. We tend to use language that's very non-committal. Hey, what do you want to do? I don't know, whatever. What the hell does whatever mean? Hey, can you give me something to drink? What do you want? I don't know. Whatever. What? That doesn't... All that does is causes conflict and miscommunication. So you should strive to use the best language possible, the most specific language possible, as opposed to levels of abstraction, like saying whatever, or get me something to drink. And to remedy that, you want to use two types of language. You want to use precise language, which is language that takes a large category and narrows it down to something very specific. So instead of saying, hey, can you get me something to drink? You would say, hey, can you get me a glass of water, right? That is precise language. Hey, can you pick me up a chair at Walmart? If I asked you to do that, there's 49 people in the two sections that I'm teaching, I would get 49 different chairs. But if I said, hey, get me a rolling computer chair with a high back and arms, that's pretty precise, right? It's pretty specific. And I know that I'm going to get 49 versions of the same thing. There might be slight differences. Some might be cloth, some might be leather, some might be black, some might be gray, but ultimately they're going to be very similar. That is precise language. Strive to be precise, because you're going to find if you use precise language, you're going to cut down a lot of miscommunications. You're going to cut down on a lot of the daily conflict that we engage in, because you're using very specific language, which does not give them room for miscommunication. The other type of language that you want to use is concrete language. Concrete language is taking something that is abstract and making it, much more, it appeals to the sense. A concrete word is a word that appeals to one of the five senses. So it's something that you can taste, you can feel, you can smell, you can hear it, you can see it. That is a concrete language. So, and what's good about concrete language is it allows us to communicate about things that are abstract, like freedom and justice, in a way that makes that idea of freedom and justice concrete. So if I say the word freedom is a very abstract word. It's very ambiguous, it means different things. But I guarantee you, when I start talking about freedom, you probably get a certain image in your mind. And that image is probably a flag or probably an eagle, because that is a concrete word. And that's what we want to do when we are talking about abstract ideas, is use concrete words, use metaphors, use similes, which allows us to communicate about abstract ideas in a concrete way. Another way to make our language more clear is to qualify our language. And what I mean by that is, if I say, when I went to England 15 years ago, or let me say, England has, all the bars in England close at 11 o'clock. Is that true right now? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. So it could be inaccurate. So people might be basing their decisions off of inaccurate information. So what I have to do is qualify my language. And you can qualify your language by a couple of ways. One of them is by dating, where you add a date, or you add a specific piece of information that says, it might be like this, but if it's not, you can't come yell at me. So example, using the England example, when I went to England 15 years ago, the bars closed at 11. So what I'm saying to you is, hey, when I was there 15 years ago, they closed at 11. They might still close at 11, but they might not. So if they don't close at 11, you can't yell at me. You know, hey, you should go to Palm Springs. That's a great place to go on spring break. So then you make all your trips and you go to Palm Springs and it's crappy because it's all like old people. So what you would want to say is, hey, I went to Palm Springs a few years ago for spring break and it was great. You might want to look into that, right? So that's what qualifying language does, is it gives you an out. So if it's not true, you can say, hey, I said it was like that 2 years ago. I didn't say it was like that now. These are all things for improving language. If you look at your PowerPoint, you're going to see an example of abstract to concrete language where it starts with the word art, which is very abstract because there's a million different types of art, and then it goes to painting, still pretty abstract. There's lots of different kinds of painting. Oil painting, a little bit more specific, a little bit more precise. Then you have impressionist oil painting, becoming more and more precise and more concrete. And then finally, Renoir's La Promenade. You know, that's a very specific, concrete thing that you can get in your mind. And that's what you want to strive for when using language. Another point on indexing, which is qualifying language, indexing and dating. If you look at your PowerPoint, you're going to see a few examples. In general, men are stronger than women, so Max is probably stronger than Barbara. Well, Barbara might actually be stronger than Max. So words like in general and probably, or in my opinion, or things like that account for people's individual tastes, individual differences. So you're making your language more precise to you. And again, giving yourself a way out in case it isn't true. You will also have to be aware that language can be confirming or disconfirming, and you have to avoid that when you speak. And language that is confirming is language that acknowledges that person. It acknowledges their presence as a human being. It acknowledges their importance. It shows acceptance to them. It shows respect for the relationship that you guys have. And that's what you want to strive for. What you want to avoid is language that ignores the other person. Not only what they're saying, but ignoring them as a whole, right? You deny the other person's significance. This is actually something that is in the book. So if you want additional examples, you can take a look at that. But we want to use language that doesn't marginalize people. And language that marginalizes people is disconfirmation, disconfirming language. This would be like racist language, words like the N-word or kike, or racial slurs are words that are disconfirming, and we want to avoid those. Another thing that we can do to make our language better is make sure that we are adapting to our listeners, right? We all have different codes. If you have a job, you have a language that is a code to that job. And if I don't speak that same language, I'm not going to get your message. We talked about that in the listening chapters. You have to adapt to your audience, basically. And so you want to use language that they understand. Avoid jargon, which is technical language to a specific group or field. You want to use slang, appropriately. Meaning, if you're with a group of people that know that slang, feel free to use it. But if you're not with that group, don't use it. I was in a speech class, and a girl started talking, this was 5 or 6 years ago, she started talking about a whip. And I had no idea what a whip was. I couldn't even get it into context. And she was talking about whip this and whip this, and I was just confused. So I had a hard time listening to what she was saying because I couldn't understand what she was talking about. And it turns out a whip is a car. Who would have thunk it? So you got to make sure that you're using language and code that your audience is going to understand. If not, think about changing your language. That's called communication accommodation. When you change some aspect of your communication to fit the person you're communicating with. And this could be style. This could be actual language itself. Language, when you know, somebody can speak Spanish and then immediately shift over to English and then back to Spanish. That's called code shifting. You see this with interpreters. A lot of bilingual people, they'll do it so quick, they don't even realize that they're speaking 2 different languages at the same time. And if you've ever seen somebody do that, it's pretty amazing because it's so innate. It's very cool. It could be style shifting. I have a friend of mine who used to be one of the head IT guys at Penn State, Maine. And he happens to be a black guy. And he's a very well-educated, very well-spoken black guy, and suit and tie kind of guy, very well-respected. And when he is with his white friends, he speaks very differently than when he's with his black friends. He actually has a second persona. He calls him the Hood. So that when he's with his black friends, he literally speaks differently than he does with his white friends. And the reason we do this, the reason why we style shift like this, is because we want to either associate ourselves with that group of people or disassociate ourselves with that group of people. So if you have a politician who's from the South, who has a really strong accent, when he's in the South, he's really using that accent a lot. But when he goes to the North, he gets rid of the accent, so he doesn't appear different. And so that's why we do code switching and style switching, to fit in or distance ourselves from a group. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that's a good way to create stronger relationships. You want to avoid any kind of ism-based language. This would be racism, heterosexism, which would be basing language that is based on somebody's sexual preference. You don't want to, for any of these isms, it's all the same. You don't want to use derogatory terms. And a lot of, for example, when it comes to being referred to as gay, a lot of gay people do not like to be called homosexuals, because to them, that has a negative connotation. When I was a kid, you called black people Negroes, and that was okay. But now if you call black people Negroes, they're going to smack you in the eye. And so you got to be careful. And the best way to do that is to ask a group, whatever group you're talking to about with, how do you refer to yourselves? So when you're talking about yourself as a group, what language, what code do you use? So that I can use that code as well. You want to avoid stereotypes. This goes back to that prejudicial language. People are individuals. You shouldn't be lumping them into any category, not just the way you treat them, but the way you speak to them, the way you speak about them. You shouldn't refer to race when race is completely irrelevant. The media makes this out to be way bigger than it actually is. If you go ask the average person on the street, how big a deal racism is, and we see the reality of it, is sure it does exist, but it doesn't exist to the extent that the media makes it out to be. And the media is constantly bringing up race when race is irrelevant. Michael Brown, it didn't matter that he was black. A man got killed, and it was a sad thing. And it doesn't matter what the circumstances were, somebody lost their life. And that's a sad thing. Black, white, yellow, green, purple, it doesn't matter. And when I talk to most people, they didn't care that he was black. The media made us think we cared about him being black. Also, you don't want to over-attribute things. We talked about over-attribution in the perception chapter. Don't make everything about that race, positive or negative. When it comes to heterosexism, this is again using language that is disparaging of gay people or lesbian people. Lesbians, transgender that whole long list of LGBTQQA. There's a whole list of those letters, and they keep changing, so I can't ever remember it. You're entitled to your opinion, but that doesn't entitle you to disparage them. That doesn't entitle you to insult them. We're all different, and that doesn't mean we can't use language that is appropriate. So to be confirming to any of these groups, don't parody or stereotype them. That can be offensive to people. Now it may not be, but it may be. So why do it, right? When somebody tells you they're gay, one of the worst things you can say to them is, "Oh, you don't look gay. I would have never known that." That's very offensive to people. That would be like you telling me, "Oh, you're black? Oh, do you play baseball? Or, I'm sorry, do you play basketball?" That's very insensitive and kind of racist. Avoid assumptions, just like with any other ism. Avoid assumptions. Learn about it. Treat them like everybody else. Treat any group like everybody else. And avoid the language that separates them. This is true for ageism, which is when you're discriminating based on people's age and gender, or not gender, generational gaps. You shouldn't talk down to old people. Like, I know I see this a lot when younger people are talking to their parents or grandparents about technology, and they treat them like they're stupid. But you have to remember, you've had technology your entire life. They haven't. So for them, this is new thing. This is new. So the next time you start getting mad at your grandpa because he doesn't know how to email or he doesn't know how to text, I want you to ask your grandpa about something that he did when he was young and see how well you can learn that. It goes the other way too. Just because people are young, you shouldn't make assumptions about people because they're young. It goes both ways. Age doesn't mean a lot. And we shouldn't be treating people or talking about people in a negative way just because they're a different age than us. Sexism, this is looking at gender, male, female, whatever. Again, avoid using the generic he. Avoid stereotyping a particular role by gender. So not all nurses are females. Not all police officers are men, right? And so if you are talking about policemen, female nurse, you're basically ignoring the entire population that isn't that gender. And that's not cool. That's never cool. You should also avoid cultural identifiers. And this goes back to what I was talking about with, refer to a group the way they refer to themselves. And understand that within every culture, it's different. Everything's different. So when you are communicating with somebody, you have to keep their culture in mind so that you don't unintentionally offend them. Now, how do you do this? Well, the best thing I can tell you is to learn about the culture. If you are dealing with somebody from another culture, learn about that culture so that you are not going to make cultural mistakes verbally. For example, the Chevy Nova. It's a car I learned to drive in. I learned to drive in a 1972 Chevy Nova. They sent that car to Mexico, and it did not sell very well because Nova means no go. So that's an example of a verbal message not crossing a language cultural barrier. Things get lost in translation all the time. And so the best way to avoid that when you're dealing with people culturally is learn about that culture. Basically what it boils down to language is understand that it's arbitrary, meaning it's random. There's no reason why a shoe is called a shoe. It's abstract, meaning it allows us to talk about things that have no concrete physical presence. It's ambiguous, meaning it means different things to different people in different situations. And we should strive to be better communicators. Use concrete language, use precise language, avoid generalistic language, which kind of lumps. We hear this all the time. People say all and every. Well, there's nothing in the world that's all or every. It doesn't work that way. So avoid those kind of things and qualify your language. You know, say, it's been my experience that all female drivers are bad. You're not all bad. I'm just using that as an example because we've all heard that. You know, all the men that I've ever met are emotionless robots. You guys aren't all emotionless robots. That's another example we've all heard, right? You can't say all men are emotionless robots or all females are bad drivers because you don't know them all. You've never met them all. You've never witnessed their behavior. So you have to qualify your language and just be mindful that language has multiple layers of meaning, and you can use that for positive or negative impact on your audience. And that's it for language, pretty much in a nutshell. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. Have a nice day. Stay out of drugs. Stay out of trouble, don't do drugs. That's what I meant to say.